Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elder, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I also pay my special respect to all the fallen heroes from Spring Revolution in Myanmar. At last, not the least, all our panel and participants from different parts of the world to join AMI seminar today. Our AMI member, Paul, will open the meeting. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mei Che, and welcome everyone. And I would like to echo what Mei Che has just said about welcoming the people involved in the struggle, and would like to make a special note of the fact that this is our first session since the release of Sean Turnell, which we're, of course, overjoyed about. This perhaps marks the next phase in our struggle, and hopefully the Australian government will now see its way clear to take some action in respect of the junta. Today's seminar is on the subject of trauma after the military coup in Myanmar, and we have a number of speakers for you. I'll introduce them in detail one by one just before they speak, but they include Raymond Tintway, Dr. Tet Tay, Professor Louise Newman, and Associate Professor Debbie Hocking. The first speaker is Raymond Tintway. He's, I think, known to most, maybe all of you. He's the Vice President of the Australia-Myanmar Institute, and he's a psychiatrist in Sydney who for many years has cared for refugees and provided support for Burmese people in both Australia and Myanmar. He's been very active in the democracy struggle over many years and been very productive both in the clinical field and in the areas of education and research. Raymond, over to you. Welcome and thank you for your talk.
Thank you, Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Paul, for your kind introduction. Thank you for this opportunity to present my views from the perspective of a Myanmar-born psychiatrist who had lived experience of a civilian living under a totalitarian system in Myanmar. May I start off by presenting a historical context. The very first military coup took place on the 2nd of March, 1962, when the then Chief of Military Armed Forces, General Ne Win, overthrew the democratically elected government of Prime Minister U Nu and dismantled the 1947 Constitution. First, I would like to refer to a doctoral thesis at the time entitled Burma's Constitution, submitted by a Burmese scholar in international law, Dr. Mau Mau, to the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands and published in 1959. In this book, the author had warned, and I quote, "If our generation should fail and fall under totalitarian forces or the totalitarian thinking and practice, this is not the end of the beginning, but the beginning of the end," unquote. The first massacre of young university students occurred on the premises of Yangon University on the 7th of July, 1962, some 4 months after the military coup. In that incident, the soldiers of General Ne Win's Tamaro, mercilessly cracked down on a group of peacefully demonstrating students by using automatic weapons, killing nearly 200 students and leaving many with symptoms of PTSD and survivor guilt. Since then, Myanmar has been a totalitarian state ruled by the successive military dictators in many different shapes or forms. In August 1988, there were about 3,000 civilians killed on the streets of Yangon, leading up to a military coup by General Somao, who took power forcibly from the civilian president, Dr. Momao. As we all know, the most recent military coup occurred on the 1st of February 2021, when Senior General Min Aung Hlaing unlawfully detained the People's Popular Leader and a Nobel laureate, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, President U Win Myint, and other political leaders who have convincingly won a free and fair democratic election. The atrocities committed by successive military regimes has risen exponentially to a horrific level in the last 21 months. The people have to endure a series of losses, pain and suffering, and the collective psychological trauma. So what are the facts? The recent report to the Human Rights Council's 15th session by Special Rapporteur demonstrated that since the February 2021 coup, junta forces have killed approximately 2,500 civilians, arrested more than 14,000, displaced more than 700,000, and plunged the country into an economic and humanitarian crisis that threatened the lives and well-being of millions. The junta has hanged 4 renowned political activists, including a lawmaker, despite consistent protests made by the international community. The report documented that soldiers and police officers have beaten, cut, and stabbed children, burned them alive, forced them to hold stress positions, subjected them to mock execution, and deprived them of food and water. Armed conflicts have often resulted in the separation of children from the parents, leaving them vulnerable to abuse. The coup has had a disastrous impact on children's access to education. According to UN monitors, at least 382 children have been killed or maimed by armed groups. The military has killed children in attacks by fighter jets, helicopters, heavy artillery, and foot soldiers. Soldiers executed children in the custody. Scores of children have died after triggering landmines planted by the Myanmar military. The Tamaraw attacks on civilian population have displaced more than 250,000 children since the coup. There have been roughly 130,000 children in protracted displacement and more than 500,000 child refugees in neighboring countries. Many displaced people suffer from deprivation of food and water as they got dispersed into hiding in the jungles and subjected to the deadly communicable diseases, including cerebral malaria and gastrointestinal diseases. Experts warn of a looming food crisis and dramatic increase in rates of childhood malnutrition. The junta is systematically restricting the delivery of humanitarian aid and others with acute needs. I would now like to discuss the psychological impact of trauma on the population. The psychological impact of trauma of such magnitude will be long-lasting and devastating. Studies have found that the action of the military dictatorship produced profound trauma, such that its mark was transgenerational and atonement would take many years. Robinson Post, in a study of the dictators Pol Pot, Idi Amin, and Joseph Stalin, commented on Pol Pot's Cambodia in a way that suggests parallels with Myanmar. They found certain common characteristics among the dictators: paranoia, xenophobia, ethnic hatred, desire for racial purity. The leader ordered the policies and the lieutenants eagerly carried them out. They also found that a paranoid collective leadership can be as brutal and destructive as a paranoid individual leader. Studies also found that impunity enjoined by military leaders will have added another layer of psychological trauma on trauma sufferers. The oppressed people suffer from loss and grief, loss of employment and livelihood, separation from their families and displacement, loss of self-esteem, loss of hope, and disruption of the social fabric, and the deprivation of formal schooling for the young people. There have been reports of increased incidence of suicide rates, particularly youth suicide, PTSD, and major depression, as well as substance use disorders, anxiety adjustment disorder, and sleep disorders. The psychological impact of the coup on the Myanmar diaspora communities via print and electronic and social media is also substantial. Many of the young people who have participated in the protest rally in the streets were arrested and subjected to torture and trauma in detention centers or imprisonment. Many of them escaped to the liberated area under the protection of ethnic armed resistance groups and decided to revolt against the military regime by joining the People's Defense Force, PDF. The brutality of the military against its own people has been increasing and getting worse. We have seen that in the bombings of schools and the recent area attacks on a concert in the Kachin state, which resulted in approximately 80 people being killed. Regarding the impact of trauma, I would like to cite Pierre Genet, a pioneering French physician, psychologist, philosopher, and psychotherapist, who wrote about psychological trauma and traumatic memory as follows. To quote him, all the famous moralists of olden days drew attention to the way in which certain events would leave indelible and distressing memories, memories to which the sufferer was continually returning, and by which he was tormented by day and by night, unquote. People of Myanmar have to endure the hardship by day and by night. And the coping strategy is exhausted, and they become overwhelmed by anxiety and low self-esteem. However, they found new energy from their own resilience and survival instinct to reject the unjust and oppressive system, which led to the civil disobedience movement, CDM, and the eventual formation of the People's Defense Force, or PDF. The elected members of parliament who have escaped the coup established an alternative system of the committee representing Pidu Tlotok, or CRPH, and the National Unity Government, NUG, working in unison with the long-standing ethnic resistance. Myanmar needs urgent help now. There are things that can be done as a matter of urgency by a country like Australia, which is recognized as one of the world's oldest liberal democracy, and other like-minded countries that protect and promote human rights, such as engaging the NUG as a resource to end the crisis in Myanmar, taking steps to deny the junta the legitimacy it seeks to project within the international community, facilitating cross-border aid to IDPs with a focus on children and families, providing alternative education system for children in IDP camps and ethnic areas, and providing fundings to organizations and programs that address the psychosocial needs of children and people suffering from trauma. Having lived under the military boots for the last 6 decades, the people of Myanmar have now gained insight into the need to eradicate the root cause of their protracted trauma, as evidenced in the people's unanimous determination to reject the military rule. I would like to end my presentation with a recommendation made by the Special Rapporteur in a report to the Human Rights Council that Myanmar needs urgent help, and the UN and other democratic countries must respond to the crisis of this country with the same urgency they have responded to the crisis in Ukraine. Before Myanmar will have a lost generation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for that very powerful speech. Before I go on to our second speaker, who's Dr. Tet Tay, I'll just mention that after we've heard the talks, we'll open for a Q&A discussion. So please feel free to formulate some questions and put them in the chat. And we'll hopefully have a good discussion, probably starting in about 20 minutes. Our second speaker is Dr. Tet Tay, who's a consultant psychiatrist in Central Queensland. Dr. Tay is highly committed to and engaged in activities directed towards the support for freedom and democratic movements globally, but of course, especially in Myanmar. He's been actively involved in a variety of Myanmar Spring revolutionary movements, along with other members of the Myanmar diaspora around the world. Dr. Tet, thank you very much for contributing to this seminar.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And thank you for everyone for attending this meeting today. And I have prepared a series of slides with many photos, and I deliberately leave the gruesome photos, but it's still, some photos can be quite disturbing, so just please forgive me. And also, I would like to give credit to photographer journalists who bravely took photos. And I would try to present in a chronological manner, for easy to follow. So just, I'm going to share with my slides now. From the beginning, yeah, I hope that everyone can see this. So this is, my very first slide is about an early days of the coup. On 1st of February 2021, Burmese people wake up, in the morning and found the, army tanks in the center of Rangoon, Mandalay, and in Naypyidaw and many cities, and with a heavy, military presence, the flexing the muscles. However, Burmese people, didn't really, submissive, and they turn up to the streets, within 2-3 days. Started with a few hundreds and turns to thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and within a few days, there were millions of people, crying for democracy and rejecting the military coup. And on the other hand, the junta, they got the agenda. They know that they know the plan. They have the plan to suppress people. So they started breaking the protests and started with the rubber bullets, water cannons, beating up the protesters and trying to break up the demonstrations across the country. And again, this is notorious, night raids, across the streets of, Rangoon, Mandalay, and many big cities. The soldiers, police, they did night raids and arrested, dragged out political activists and, demonstrator, big political figures from their home and put in the jail. And this is, a scratch on the right side. You can see the scratch of, people staying in prison. And on the left side, there's also a gate of notorious insane prison. And many people arrested and put in a very poor living condition, and a lot of people being tortured and many, perish in prison. And that doesn't stop there. I remember within a month, by 3rd or 4th week, military junta started to shoot at people with live bullets. And they shoot at innocent, peaceful protester with machine guns and even heavy artilleries. And more than 1,000 people, pass away, while they are, demonstrating peacefully. Now, I want to move on to second part of my presentation. And this is about the search of IDP. So after the shooting, the peaceful demonstration obviously dying down, but it's still ongoing, but not in a big number. And National Unity Government, NUG, was founded, and PDF, Defense Forces, Resistance Forces, were founded. And people started to have an armed struggle with homemade guns. And then military changed tactics in a very brutal way. They started to, go into the villages in a very peaceful Middle Burma in Sagaing and Magway region, where there are about 10 million people there. The pattern is very simple. The Myanmar army troops entered the village and arrested villagers, civilians, started to beat and torture, and kill a few to instill a fear factor and torch the village. And this has been ongoing for more than a year. And estimated about more than 30,000 houses were burned, many villages were torched, and that has been ongoing. And this is, so as we can see, there's a heaps of photos and video clips, evidence, about what happened in Middle Burma. It doesn't stop there. In parallel, we can see people in Karen minority and people fleeing from Myanmar army, because, not necessarily the army troops, there were airstrikes and there were heavy artillery, deliberately targeting the civilians in Karenni region, Kachin region, Rakhine, everywhere for ethnic minority. It has been like hell. Now, this is my last part. So I have picked up, out of many crimes against humanity, I have picked up 5 massacre, big incidents over the last 12 months. Starting with the very first one, this is called Christmas Eve massacre, happened in Mosul, near Mosul village in Fruso area, Karenni state. On that particular day on Christmas Eve, there were 40 people who traveling in a car, and they are very innocent, ethnic villagers traveling from one place to another. They were stopped by the Division 66 military army, and they were arrested and stabbed, shot, and burned somewhere alive. And out of these 40 people, 5 women and 3 children included, and there were 2 saved the children. UNICEF staff was included. It was the biggest massacre in Karenni state ever recorded. Now, this is now this year, in May 2022. On that particular day, in a central Burma, Sagaing region, in a village called Mountain Vin village, the army troop entered in the morning and arrested 28 villagers. Again, they are civilian, they are innocent people, and shot at and burned, and they burned 38 houses on that particular day with people. And this is, in July, back in July. So far, the military junta gave 128 death sentences, and they executed 4 political prisoners back in July. It included Kujimi, Kupyo Ziato, Kutlamyu Au, Ku Angtuazo, 4 political activists. Kujimi is 1988 generation student leader, and he's been in and out of prison. He's a political activist. When he passed away, he was age 53. And Kupyo Ziato is a rapper in a very famous rap, a band called AEST, and he's also a parliament member. And when he passed away, he was 41. Now I want to move on and talk about the massacre on the school children. So on that particular day, again in Middle Burma, in Sagaing region, in a place called Layako village, and there were about 200 school children, started their day attending school, and out of nowhere, 2 helicopters arrived and started to shoot at the school non-stop for 45 minutes with a machine gun. And 13 people perished, and out of them, 7 children died. This is my last slide. So maybe many of you might have heard about the Anampa Pakan bombing, that occurred about a month ago in Kachin remote region. And on that particular day, people are having a music concert, and in the evening, enjoying, their life, enjoying the music. Some people were cooking. And out of nowhere, 3 military jets arrived, the blue jets arrived and bombed directly on the music concert and killed more than 80 people, injured more than 100. And out of them, there were many famous singer, musician, businessmen, men, women, children died. And this is, again, this is a biggest, the worst recorded massacre in Kachin state history, that many people were killed on a single night. Now, I would like to end my slideshow, and what I have tried to capture, the traumas, that happened since the coup. And like Dr. Raymond said, despite all these, the breaking up and suppression, the Burmese people still really resilient, and they tried, to continue their struggle, rejecting the military junta, and still crying and fighting for democracy. I think that's really amazing of their bravery. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ted, for that very moving and disturbing talk. In spite of the inspiring words at the end, it's hard not to be distressed by the things that you showed us. Now, our next speaker is Louise Newman. Louise, thank you so much for joining us. Louise is a child psychiatrist in Melbourne who works in the area of trauma and its impact on child development and mental health. She works especially with asylum seekers and refugees and their children, and is a past advisor to the Australian government on the impact of immigration detention and damage to traumatised children. She's the convener of the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Group and chairs the Victorian College of Psychiatry, Royal Australian-New Zealand College of Psychiatry Racism Awareness Working Group. Louise, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here to say a few words about the issues confronting children and adolescents in these sorts of conditions of atrocity and essentially state-sponsored child abuse, if you want to use that terminology. So children, unfortunately, are often the forgotten victims. Children, like anyone else in these situations, try and adapt as best they can to the situation. But in many ways, children carry the burden of the trauma they are exposed to in their very development. So trauma has widespread effects on children's neurological and psychological and social development. For some children that I've worked with, their whole experience of life has been in one of these many traumatising and appalling situations that we come across in various parts of the world. The situation at the moment that we're talking about this evening is one of those atrocities of great magnitude, clearly. And the memories of these traumatic experiences for children and those who try and care for them as best they can, their parents and other family members and people in the community, memories are inscribed literally into the fabric of the developing brain. So we see children developing quite significant difficulties in their development, particularly those who are infants, and those in the 0 to 3 or 4 age range, as they try and survive in these environments where parents and carers themselves are obviously utterly overwhelmed. And we describe that as the unmediated experience of trauma. In other words, there's no one really there in the way that they would ideally like to be, who can ultimately protect children in those situations. So these sorts of situations have been described as a breakdown of the possibility of child protection, despite what parents and families and communities are trying to do. Parents themselves in these situations, as you're aware, will have their own range of trauma-related emotional reactions, and what we could call post-traumatic stress disorder. So obviously very significant. It's very hard to maintain hope in situations such as you've been discussing this evening. So feelings of hopelessness, despair, although we see remarkable tales of resilience and survival amongst people who really do everything that they can to try and provide some shelter and protection for children. But children are, of course, very sensitive to the emotional states of parents, and they look into the face and eyes of their parents and carers for some understanding of what's going on. But sadly, these are situations that are not able to be explained because there is no rational explanation that you can give a young child to understand what's happening. So we see children who, according to their age, will respond to trauma in different ways. Children can develop difficulties in their attachments to other people, even their parents. So attachment difficulties, they can become angry at times, they can have behaviour problems as parents might experience it. And these are all signs that the experience that they're having is overwhelming their coping capacity at their particular age. Adolescents can often have a range of depressive and anxiety symptoms, as you would expect. And quite typical symptoms of being very, very traumatised, particularly in situations of genocide and massacre, and some of the other situations that we're all too familiar with in the modern world. We think about the world at the moment, and the situation in the Ukraine would be another example where children are amongst the most vulnerable. Everyone, of course, is suffering, but children are amongst the most vulnerable. So this sort of stress, the high levels of stress that children are experiencing, impacts their development in multiple ways. Children can become quite overwhelmed. So even in this country, and certainly in parts of Europe, we've seen children who enter into a state of utter withdrawal, sometimes called a pervasive refusal syndrome, because they refuse to eat or drink or speak. They're semi-conscious. And we, here in this country, and certainly in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, have had quite significant numbers of children, usually asylum seekers who've been exposed to violence, may have witnessed atrocities, even witnessed attempted genocides, and they are unrousable. So it's almost as if these children go into a protective cocoon and will remain in that state for some time until they feel safe. So a very self-protective mechanism. And so some of these reactions are very significant. Children show short-term responses to trauma, but also the long-term legacy of trauma. Trauma during rapid periods of development affects social functioning, affects understanding of emotions, and at a very significant existential level, these are children who are puzzling, trying to work out how on earth this can occur in a situation where there really is very little that can be said to them to ultimately reassure them. So those memories and that experience can lead to long-term symptoms related to the trauma and the literal reliving of those experiences. This was originally, as I'm sure it has happened before in human history, but was originally very well described in children who survived the Holocaust in Europe, and child survivors of some of very, significant atrocities. Children in the former Yugoslavia. The list is it's like a terrible litany of where we have repeated and repeated for political or whatever other reasons there might be, this legacy of harm on children. So these are potentially lifelong effects, and I think that's something very important that we need to be advocating for the needs of children and reminding those who are involved in that this is not just a simple matter of recovery, some brief therapies and recovery. This literally affects the whole of someone's life, and we certainly see that. For the parents themselves and others in the community are trying to protect children, these memories of what they tried to do and in some cases could not do in the way that they wanted to will also affect them for the rest of their lives. Witnessing the deaths of children, such as we saw in the last presentation, being in a position of identifying one's own child who has died in those sorts of circumstances leaves scars in parents that is very hard for them to recover from at all. So I would describe this as a situation where we have both traumatised parents and traumatised children, obviously traumatised communities, and one of the major healing factors, I think, for many is the opportunity to recount and have a narrative that gives an account of the trauma, to bear witness to what has happened, to be able to, in a safe way, when and if that might be possible, to share with others, and to be able to regain some sense of hope that humanity might be able to have some better ways of thinking about vulnerability and how we should respond to it. In the middle of it, that's not possible, I would think. I think we never want to minimise or make light of the suffering that is actually occurring, despite the fact that some people are maybe so resilient that they're still working on helping others, which is truly admirable. So I think the sort of work that you're doing and many people working in the human rights arena is doing does need to point out the vulnerability of some groups, the need for better services, and how we can do advocacy that's not just about, though it's very important, maintaining some sort of dialogue and preventive approach. It's also about looking at models of healing and trauma recovery when not many people in our service systems are used to seeing and thinking about trauma, massive trauma at this level. So there are lessons for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Louise. It's a difficult story, isn't it? And it continues. And we're obviously not free from all of these effects in Australia. So we're focusing today on Myanmar, of course, but these are problems all around the world. Our last speaker is Debbie Hocking. Debbie is a clinician and a researcher who works with people seeking asylum. She has a doctorate in clinical psychology and has worked in a research capacity at the Florey Institute and Cabrini Outreach, and in a clinical role at the Cabrini Asylum Seeker and Refugee Health Hub in Brunswick. Debbie, thank you very much for joining us. I think, Meche, you're operating Debbie's slides for her. Thank you. Over to you, Debbie. No, we can't hear you yet. Are you muted?
I am muted, and this is why I don't do the slides. Thank you, Paul, and fellow speakers. Thank you for inviting me to share some thoughts on this important topic. I have reflected on the work that I've been doing in the refugee and asylum seeker space, and how research undertaken by myself and Professor Suresh Sundram may contribute to this conversation. And in doing so, I noted some connections between two of our recent research studies and the trauma aftermath of the most recent military coup in Myanmar, when hopefully sooner rather than later there will be an aftermath, it will end. So slide 2, thank you, May. So the first connection that I draw reference to in relation to our research is examining the psychiatric morbidity of resettled adolescent refugees. Half of our sample of the 81 adolescents were from camps from the Thai-Myanmar border or resettled directly from Myanmar. The majority were Karen, but Burmese, Karenni, Chin were also represented in that sample. And this was just prior to COVID starting, so we wrapped up the first phase of this at the end of 2019. So the paper is currently under peer review, but a key finding was that those who were resettled to Australia from camps, having been born in a camp, and therefore not themselves having been subject to displacement, had significantly lower symptoms than adolescents who had an experience of displacement, either internally displaced or crossing international borders and living in a transit country after leaving their home or being forced to leave their home. And we theorised that residing in a stable refugee camp may prevent or mitigate against psychopathology, that's an important distinction, through the provision of relative security, stability and predictability, and the provision of organised displacement or assisted relocation to a good enough setting with a sense of community has been found to reduce mental distress and promote psychosocial well-being. Yeah, continue on for the next slide. The healing potential of community connections can't be underestimated. It's the collective response to paranoia, xenophobia, and ethnic hatred and division, whereby this collective is more potent than the sum of its parts. And I note that previous contributors to this forum have highlighted the prerequisite for peace being trust, and before that, open dialogue, the strengthening of or reforging of neighbourhood connections at the grassroots level. And once the weapons are spent, arguably the greatest threat to a post-conflict society is division and isolation. And this can breed mistrust and paranoia and fuel reenactment of trauma, which can become a self-perpetuating source of transgenerational trauma. And this leads me to my next slide. Thank you. And the next research study that I in some way connected to this conversation today, and that's the concept of moral injury. In 2001, a bit of background to our research in the context of moral injury in relation to what we're discussing here. In 2001, the Australian government implemented a policy dubbed the Pacific Solution, for those who aren't aware, and that was to relocate asylum seekers, people seeking refuge who arrived by sea, maritime arrivals, and moved them to offshore detention centres in Pacific Islands of Nauru and Manus Island, Papua New Guinea, while their refugee status was determined. After 7 years of the Pacific Solution, after seven years after that was decommissioned, only to be revived again in 2012 until the present day. So the trauma experienced by the individuals and families subject to this policy of deterrence, which is what it is, in terms of deterring people arriving by boat under the guise of humanitarian concerns. Those subject to these policies of deterrence of offshore detention, essentially, has defied a single and simple psychiatric classification, such as PTSD. And this paper, the moral injury paper, discusses the applicability of the term moral injury, which historically has been, or it was born out of the military contexts, So discusses the applicability of this term to those subject to offshore processing policies. And our results highlighted the potentially harmful mental health impact of experiencing multiple transgressions of one's moral frameworks, a sense of what's, inherently right and wrong. And a moral injury can be caused by a self-transgression, such as betraying a friend or family in order to escape one's own torture or death, or a transgression by others, such as those with the power to protect who fail to do so. So an example here might be the industrialized world's outrage at, and rightful outrage at the Russian military force that's being used against Ukrainian civilians, but whilst apparently turning a blind eye to the terror and slaughter that has been inflicted on scores of innocent civilians in Myanmar by the military junta for almost 2 years, coming up to 2 years. And next slide, thank you, May. So in a previous seminar, Dr. Raymond drew attention to the mental health consequences caused by extensive grief and loss, and that recovery is harder in the absence of support and hope. And as Dr. Raymond has noted, collective trauma underpins and compounds individuals' trauma and individual trauma, and the enormity of collective trauma and the accompanying helplessness risks intergenerational trauma being passed down the line. And next slide, thank you. Just a couple more slides, and I just wanted to shift the focus from that, I guess, the idea of moral injury and moving away from a purely psychiatric classification of existential suffering caused by war and trauma and collective suffering, and also counterpointing that with the possibility of relative stability, even for refugee populations, where there is some predictability and relative safety. So what brings this together is the ADAPT model, and it is an acronym. And there it is there, Adaptation and Development After Persecution and Trauma. So this was coined by Professor Derek Silo and his team, and it works on the principle of what happens in the post-torture, conflict, trauma environment affects the outcome and conceptualizes psychosocial domains, 5 of those, or pillars of threats to safety, which can lead to or exacerbate psychological symptoms, but if flipped around, can also guide recovery. So next slide, thank you. So here we have the five pillars or domains. On the left-hand side, the threat, and on the leading to potential symptoms, psychosocial symptoms. And I guess a couple of examples of flipping that around, where there is symptoms, but trying to leverage some recovery from those is, for example, the attachment bonding, which, of course, when that's broken down at its extreme, mistrust, paranoia, othering of others, and the opposite of that, of course, is social connection to rebuild trust or build trust, social connectivity and dialogue, neighbour to neighbour, grassroots up. Another example, I guess, of identity and role is that of finding work, or be that paid or unpaid work. And these are 2 primary, really key protective factors that we see play out in people who are seeking asylum here and throughout the world. where there is ongoing insecurity, and many of those domains are really challenged, if not broken down. But if there's one or two that we can leverage to try to bolster a sense of resilience and or rebuild those particular pillars through social connectivity, through meaningful connections or activities, then that may well be a step that may apply to post-conflict Myanmar. And just the last slide here, thank you. So this last slide just essentially is a slide, a nod to the ADAPT model and its the benefit really of it as in application in terms of translational research. So there was a study completed, there's been a couple actually, but this one stood out to me because it was actually related to Myanmar. And I'm not going to go through all of these here because I know we're very short on time, but I did just want to bring that full circle and I guess to offer some hope for future recovery at the grassroots level and at the community level. And I guess this is a model that absolutely has some evidence, some growing evidence behind it. And I'll just leave it there. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And there is a little bit of cause for hope there, although at this stage the post-trauma or post-torture environment in Myanmar seems a long way away, very sadly. Now, we are running a bit short of time. With your permission, I might keep going for another 5 minutes or so to enable us to bring some of the threads together. Obviously, I understand some people will have to leave. That's totally fine. I think at this point we should go back to Raymond and Tet. Perhaps having listened to what you've heard from Debbie and Louise, how do you envisage the next phase in Myanmar? Now, how do you understand what the kind of depth and long-term implications of these terrible events will play out? Raymond, do you want to start?
Thanks for that, Paul. And we also been thinking about that issue. I mean, obviously, a lot of trauma people have been going through. There should be an end stage somewhere. And how do you get them rehabilitated in due course? Looking at the model of South Africa, for instance, and East Timor, they live under the foreign rule for 24 years. Previously, were colonized by Portuguese. They had set up this Reception, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think the Louise has alluded to it. It's very important to get them compensated in some way because they seeing or witnessing the impunity. We added another layer of trauma. So there should be some way of negotiating and getting the sort of feeling validated. So in the various form, they have been doing that. So that one model I've been thinking, and also listening to Debbie with the model injury, is similar to the concept of the child abuse, isn't it? Like where your parent who is supposed to be protecting you in this state-sponsored trauma situation, your parent themselves has been abusing you. So there's an added layer there. It's a very complex situation, and as you said, Paul, it's a far way to get to the solution to it. But we've been thinking about those sort of things, and when the time comes, we have to really think of how to get it implemented.
Thank you for that comment. Kesh, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I think, along the same line, like, Raymond and Louise and Deb, and there were heaps of, psychological traumas, in many ways for the children and, all the people. And when I've spoken to the people on the ground and they are really frightened of, the sound of the, jets and things like that and heavy artillery. It's still a trauma ongoing. And at the same time, they are struggling with, food, shelter, warm clothes and medication and everything. So I think the way forward to me is practically, they need a basic needs, coming through, IGO and all sorts of things. And at the same time, we should provide as early as possible psychosocial support, counseling, supported therapies, and train the trainers and ease the pain really. And following that, my hope is like we had brief discussion the other day, it's about the healing. I think healing process also need to be really, thought of. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Perhaps we can just briefly go back to Debbie and Louise on the subject of healing. What are the preconditions for healing, perhaps, or what are the sort of things that we need to look for? And then to close, I'll ask Tet and Raymond to comment about what reconciliation might ultimately look like in Myanmar. Debbie, do you want to comment on the healing process?
Just to really reiterate what Dr. Raymond said, justice really, there needs to be an acknowledgement of there aren't words for it really. There needs to be an acknowledgement that is, equal to and really calls out what is happening, and post this series of atrocities, what has happened. Because really, until there is justice, there can't be true healing. It will just fester. So, yeah, I agree.
Louise, thanks for that, Debbie. Louise, a number of people have mentioned the role of the witness, and that, in a sense, provides a record that acknowledges or establishes the kind of depth of the suffering. Would you like to comment on that, and how has that been important in the Australian context?
Yes, it certainly has. I think that the notion of seeking justice is partly an issue of seeking acknowledgement of the reality of the suffering and the storytelling around that. Many people, if you look at major war and these sort of situations, are bystanders, meaning, and that's, I think, a very significant moral issue where people see but are fearful, or for whatever reasons don't speak out, don't act. So therefore, whether they know it or not, collude and actually support these things. And that's a very difficult position to be in. Witnesses can bear witness. And we've certainly worked in my work here with asylum seekers in detention, with recording stories, with being able to look at it creatively as well. I think this notion of recovery is also a creative process. It's not just treat the psychiatric disorder if we, not that we have very competent diagnostic ways for describing these situations, but it is a matter of regaining meaning in a very active way, however people can do that. But the first step, I think, is a process. And in some countries, it has been social justice, truth and reconciliation processes, and so on. Australia needs to do that for its Indigenous people. It's really quite similar, and acknowledge the reality of colonialism. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are involved in these atrocities necessarily take responsibility, but people feel validated, acknowledged, and they might be able to create meaning, which is why something like the Nuremberg trials after the Holocaust was so important for those who survived. And they went on for so long. And yet you still have in those communities, which happens to be my family background, you have people telling those stories, and very elderly people, of what they went through, because they do not want that to be forgotten, obviously. So these processes, I think, are fundamental. The Australian situation has some, which I'm sure a lot of people will have heard about, in the way that vulnerable people were treated within detention particularly, has been not fully acknowledged by successive governments. In fact, these conditions have actually been maintained And we still have people who now are in a state of moral injury, who are extremely suffering at a very deep level. But some of their, the ways they get through that is to express it creatively. And I mean, you'll probably be thinking of people that get a certain amount of media coverage because they're creatively expressing what happened to them, but that's a way of survival for those people.
Okay, thank you, Louise. I'm sure all of us here look forward to the Yangon trials. Hopefully they'll happen one day. Dr. Tet, can I move to you, and then I'll give Raymond a chance to close the discussion. Both you and Raymond really spoke some inspiring words about the resistance that's occurring in Myanmar and the resilience that the population is showing, or at least some sections of them are showing. Can you tell us just a little bit more about the kind of psychological drivers of that struggle and how you understand the implications of that?
Can I start, Sir Raymond?
Yes, please. Yeah, please.
Yeah. I think resistance is everywhere, and I think it's still growing, gradually. And the motivation for armed resistance by the people is about between justice and injustice. And also, it's not just about revenge or retaliation. And Burma has been under military regime since 1962. So it's a very long time. And people now really hungry for democracy, and they are really fighting for democracy in their era. So I think resistance will be ongoing and growing. And that's what happened. And just briefly talk about, that healing. And on the one hand, there's aggressor like, Myanmar military army. And, army is not just the army, it has families, it has very big organization. On the other hand, people who's been oppressed and tortured and slaughtered. So, however, I think one cannot abolish each other. So they have to find a way in a healing process. It's a long, there's no shortcut. It's a long process. And aggressor, need to face the justice. And also at the same time, they need to be honest about what they have done and talk about it and listen from other side. And they need to have a motivation to understand how people will suffer. And then only then, it can be resolved. And the two community, the army community and the rest can, live peacefully together and move on. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that. And Raymond, if I can just say, as an outsider, one of the most striking things for me about the struggle in Myanmar is that despite the legacy of brutality and trauma and massacre, if you like, there's been this surviving ability to forgive and to envisage a possibility of reconciliation. And that's embodied in many of the people here today, and if you don't mind my saying so, including yourself. Perhaps you can explain how it is that despite all the terrible things that have occurred and that individuals, including yourself, have been through, how is it that you can still have optimism and hope for the future?
Thanks, and thanks for the poll. I mean, the basic thing is like one's resilience. I mean, this we have to build on the resilience, and in the disaster management, we learned that there's no good to be pathologizing the symptom. I mean, of course, people suffer from all these symptoms and PTSD and adjustment problem, all those things. But for the longer-term recovery, one's resilience has to be built on. So resilience promotion is one of the management of disaster management. I look at this thing as a disaster. What's happening, the post-coup traumatic experience is like a man-made disaster of such a magnitude. It's a man-made disaster. So and that's where community involved. Community cohesion has been disrupted. So we need to build on it. And earlier speaker, I think Debbie alluded to the fact that it's very important they should be connected with the neighborhood and talk to each other. So we need to instill hope in them. as part of it. So my own experience, as I've witnessed personally, and over time, then you build your own resilience, resistance, and then fight back. And I alluded to the fact that Burma has been under the military boots for 60 years, 6 decades, and people have lost their hope, they lost their self-esteem, they've been treated as dirt, and the parent-like figure has been abusing them, that sort of thing. But they had to sort of get up and put up their strength and do something about it, and which we are witnessing at the moment. Young people, this Spring Revolution has been organized by the young people. They call it Spring Revolution because these young people grew up in an era of Aung San Suu Kyi, where people were treated nicely and their independence has been fostered. They have the opportunity to learn some occupational sort of trades and things like that, and they know the value of the how to be more assertively talking about themselves. So these people, as they grew up, and when they witnessed that, as opposed to our era, many years ago, when we witnessed it, we've been really easily become submissive because we've been, if you like, conditioned by the military rule for the 60 odd years. So we just go along with it. But the new era, the young people won't accept it. They started resisting. So that's where the PDF and resistance thing happened. And the Burmese people themselves has been supporting it. So it's about time that they have already gained insight into it. The solution to all these problems is to eliminate the perpetrator. That's the only way, no other way around. And they already had a taste of democracy with all the assistance given by international community. They don't want to lose it again. So that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you very much. Despite the darkness of the times, there are still important and powerful reasons for optimism and hope. That brings this session to a close. I'd like to thank our 4 presenters, Dr. Raymond, Dr. Tet, Dr. Louise and Dr. Debbie for your powerful and important talks. This is the last AMI seminar for the year, and on behalf of the Australia-Myanmar Institute and especially its president, Chris Lamb, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, I'd like to thank you for your attendance and look forward to seeing you next time early next year. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you,
Everyone.
Priya.
Thank you.